The dust never settled in Copper Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1882. It danced perpetually in the harsh afternoon sun, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that matched the town's weathered spirit. Most folks hurried past the old blacksmith shop at the end of Main Street, their eyes averted from the man who worked there in complete silence. Thomas Reed hadn't spoken a word in 3 years. The scars told their own stories across his broad shoulders and calloused hands, some thin and precise like knife work, others thick and ropey from burns that spoke of violence survived rather than accidents endured. At 34, his face carried lines too deep for his years, and his grey eyes held the weight of memories he'd never share. The townspeople whispered theories. Apache raids, cattle rustlers, a betrayal gone wrong. But Thomas just hammered iron into horseshoes, mended broken wagon wheels, and kept his silence like a sacred vow. The forge fire cast dancing shadows across his scarred forearms as he worked, the rhythmic ring of metal on metal, the only voice he allowed himself. Mrs. Patterson from the general store would leave payment for his work on the wooden counter, never expecting conversation. Doc Morrison nodded respectfully when their paths crossed, understanding that some wounds ran deeper than flesh. As evening painted the sky in shades of copper and gold, Thomas was banking his forge when he heard it, the sound of wheels struggling through the rutted street, accompanied by labored breathing and quiet sobs. Through his shop's open doorway, he watched a woman stumble down from a battered wagon, her dress torn and stained with mud and worse things. She couldn't have been more than 25, with auburn hair hanging in disheveled strands around a face marked by exhaustion and terror. Emma Sullivan clutched a small carpet bag with trembling hands, looking around Copper Creek's single street as if searching for sanctuary in a place that offered little hope to anyone. Her journey from Kansas had been a nightmare of broken wagon wheels, wolves circling their camp at night, and men with cruel eyes who'd taken everything else she'd owned before she managed to escape in the pre-dawn darkness. Thomas watched from the shadows as she approached the saloon, then backed away from its noise and harsh laughter. She tried the church, but found it locked. The hotel's painted sign promised rooms, but when she checked her nearly empty purse, her shoulders sagged with defeat. Night was falling fast, and Copper Creek wasn't the kind of town where a woman wanted to find herself alone on the streets after dark. He'd seen that look before, the specific exhaustion that came not just from physical hardship, but from having nowhere left to run. Without conscious thought, Thomas stepped from his shop into the dusty street. Emma turned at the sound of his boots, and for a moment their eyes met. She tensed, ready to flee again, but something in his expression stopped her. There was no hunger there, no calculation, just a quiet steadiness that felt like the first safe thing she'd encountered in weeks. Thomas gestured toward his shop with a slight movement of his hand, then waited. He didn't approach her, didn't speak. He simply stood there, offering without demanding, his presence steady as the mountains that ringed their small town. Emma hesitated, studying his face in the dim light from his forge. The scars were immediately visible. A jagged line along his left jaw, another across his right temple, countless smaller marks that spoke of violence survived. But his eyes held something she'd almost forgotten existed: kindness without expectation. I don't have much money," she whispered, her voice hoarse from dust and crying. Thomas shook his head once, a simple gesture that said money wasn't what mattered here. He turned and walked slowly toward his shop, not looking back, not pressuring her to follow. The choice was entirely hers. After a long moment, Emma's feet moved almost of their own accord. She followed this silent stranger into his workshop, where the dying embers of the forge cast warm light across walls lined with tools and finished ironwork. In the back, she could see a simple living area, a bed, a small table, shelves with books, and a few personal belongings. Thomas moved to a corner and unrolled a clean blanket, spreading it near the forge where the stone still radiated heat. He brought her a tin cup of water and a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, setting them beside the makeshift bed before retreating to give her space. "Thank you," Emma breathed, sinking onto the blanket with relief so profound it made her bones ache. Thomas nodded once, then settled into a chair by his workbench, close enough that she would feel protected, far enough that she wouldn't feel trapped. He picked up a piece of leather, beginning to work on what looked like a bridle repair, his movements calm and methodical. For the first time in weeks, Emma felt safe enough to close her eyes. The gentle sound of Thomas's leatherwork, the fading warmth from the forge, and the solid presence of this scarred guardian created a sanctuary she hadn't dared hope for. Outside, Copper Creek settled into its restless night, but inside the blacksmith's shop, peace finally found a place to rest. As sleep claimed her, Emma's last conscious thought was wonder at how this silent man had given her something that all the words in the world couldn't provide, the simple, precious gift of safety. Thomas worked late into the night, keeping watch over the woman who'd stumbled into his solitary world, his own scars aching with remembered pain and unexpected hope. The morning sun slanted through the shop's windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like golden spirits above Emma's sleeping form. She woke to the sound of Thomas already at work, his hammer ringing against heated steel in a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back, along with the profound relief of waking somewhere safe. Thomas paused in his work when he noticed her stirring, setting his tools aside to bring her a basin of clean water and a rough but clean towel. He'd also laid out what looked like a woman's dress, simple calico but mended and clean. "Where did you—" Emma began, then stopped. The dress was obviously old, carefully preserved. Thomas's eyes held a flicker of old pain as he glanced at it, then back to her face. He didn't answer, couldn't answer, but Emma understood. There had been someone else once, someone who'd mattered enough that he'd kept her dress all these years. The realization brought a complex mix of gratitude and sorrow. She was being offered not just clothing, but a sacred memory. "Thank you," she whispered, accepting the gift with the reverence it deserved. Thomas nodded and returned to his forge, giving her privacy to wash and change. The dress fit reasonably well, and wearing clean clothes made Emma feel more human than she had in days. When she emerged from behind the blanket he'd hung for her privacy, she found Thomas setting out a simple breakfast: eggs, bacon, and coffee. They ate in comfortable silence, Emma stealing glances at her mysterious benefactor. In daylight, his scars were more pronounced but somehow less frightening. They spoke of survival rather than violence, of a man who'd endured rather than inflicted. His hands, she noticed, were gentle with everything he touched. The coffee cup, the tools of his trade, even the way he'd laid out her breakfast spoke of someone who understood the value of careful treatment. "I should tell you," Emma said quietly, breaking their peaceful quiet. "There might be men looking for me. I ran away from some people who weren't kind to me." Thomas's grey eyes sharpened, focusing on her face with complete attention. Emma saw something flicker there, a recognition, perhaps even anger on her behalf. "If they come here," she continued, her voice wavering slightly, "I don't want to bring trouble to your door." Thomas stood then, walking to a wooden chest in the corner. From it, he withdrew a gun belt and holster, the leather worn smooth with use. He strapped it around his waist with practiced ease, then checked the weapon with movements that spoke of long familiarity. When he looked back at Emma, his meaning was unmistakable. Let them come. The simple gesture sent a wave of emotion through Emma that nearly brought tears to her eyes. This man, this stranger who owed her nothing, was prepared to stand between her and whatever danger might follow. Without words, he'd made a promise that resonated deeper than any spoken vow. Over the following days, a routine developed between them. Emma helped around the shop, sweeping, organizing tools, tending the small garden behind the building where Thomas grew vegetables. She discovered he was an exceptional craftsman. His ironwork bore the mark of true artistry, from delicate hinges for the church door to sturdy horseshoes that would last through harsh Wyoming winters. The townspeople began to adjust to Emma's presence, though their curiosity was palpable. Mrs. Patterson from the general store was the first to approach, her motherly instincts overcoming small-town caution. "You settling in all right, dear?" she asked Emma one afternoon when she came to collect a repaired pot handle. "Yes, ma'am. Thomas has been very kind." Mrs. Patterson glanced toward the forge where Thomas worked, his concentration complete as he shaped a piece of hot iron. "That man's got a good heart, though he's been through more than his share of troubles. Been 3 years since he spoke a word to anyone." Emma felt a stir of curiosity but didn't ask. Whatever had stolen Thomas's voice was his story to tell, if he ever chose to. "Some folks think it's strange," Mrs. Patterson continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "A man and woman living together unmarried. But I tell them Thomas Reed is more honorable than most men who preach virtue on Sundays. He's taking care of you proper, and that's what matters." Emma nodded gratefully, understanding that she'd found an ally in the older woman. That evening, as they shared another quiet supper, Emma ventured a question that had been building in her mind. "The dress you gave me, was she your wife?" Thomas's hand stilled on his coffee cup. For a long moment, Emma thought he wouldn't respond at all. Then slowly he nodded once. What happened to her? This time, Thomas looked directly at Emma, and she saw such deep pain in his eyes that she immediately regretted asking. But instead of turning away, he stood and walked to his workbench, returning with a small piece of paper, a newspaper clipping, yellow with age. The headline made Emma's breath catch: "Local ranch family murdered by outlaws." The article was brief, clinical in its description of a home invasion that had claimed the lives of Samuel Reed, his wife Margaret, and their young daughter. Only one son had survived, though he was found badly wounded and has not spoken since the tragedy. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she handed the clipping back to Thomas. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Thomas carefully folded the paper and returned it to his pocket. Then he did something unexpected. He reached across the table and briefly touched Emma's hand, a gesture of shared understanding. Both of them had lost everything. Both had survived when perhaps they shouldn't have. In that moment, their silence became a bridge between two wounded souls. Outside, a coyote called to its pack somewhere in the darkness beyond Copper Creek, but inside the blacksmith shop, two people who'd forgotten how to trust began to remember what it felt like to not be alone in the world. Emma squeezed Thomas's scarred hand gently before he pulled away. And for the first time since arriving in Copper Creek, she began to believe that perhaps she'd found more than just temporary shelter. Perhaps she'd found home. 3 weeks into Emma's stay in Copper Creek, the peace they'd built together was shattered by the thunder of approaching horses. Emma was hanging laundry behind the blacksmith shop when she heard them. 4 riders coming hard down Main Street, their horses lathered with sweat and their eyes scanning every building with predatory intent. Her blood turned to ice. She recognized the leader immediately, Jake Morrison, a man whose smile was as cruel as his reputation. He'd been the one to hire her and 3 other women in Kansas City, promising work as seamstresses for wealthy families out west. Instead, he'd sold them to the highest bidders, treating them like cattle at auction. Emma dropped the wet shirt she'd been hanging and ran for the shop, her heart hammering against her ribs. Thomas looked up from his work as she burst through the doorway, taking one look at her terror-stricken face before setting down his hammer and moving to the window. The riders had stopped in front of the saloon, but their leader was already dismounting, his gaze sweeping the street with calculating precision. "It's them," Emma whispered, pressing herself against the back wall of the shop. "The men I told you about. They've found me." Thomas turned from the window, and Emma saw something in his expression that made her breath catch, not fear, but a cold, controlled fury that transformed his entire demeanor. This wasn't the gentle blacksmith she'd come to know. This was the man who'd survived having his entire family murdered, who'd learned to live with scars that went far deeper than flesh. He moved to his gun belt, checking the weapon with practiced efficiency, then grabbed a rifle from a rack near his bed. But instead of heading for the door, he gestured for Emma to follow him to the back of the shop, where a narrow ladder led to a small loft space. "No," Emma said, shaking her head. "I won't hide while you face them alone. There are 4 of them, Thomas." Thomas's grey eyes met hers, and in them she saw not just determination, but something that looked almost like peace, as if this confrontation was something he'd been preparing for his entire life. He touched her face gently, a gesture that spoke of affection and farewell, then pointed firmly toward the ladder. Before Emma could protest further, Jake Morrison's voice boomed across the street. "Thomas Reed, I know you've got something that belongs to me. Send her out and we'll conduct our business civilized-like." Thomas positioned himself near the front window, rifle ready but held low. Emma reluctantly climbed the ladder, but instead of hiding, she found a crack in the loft floor that allowed her to see the shop below. "I'm waiting, Reed," Morrison called again. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The woman's worth good money, and I aim to collect what's owed me." Through the shop's front window, Emma could see the 4 men spreading out, 2 positioning themselves across the street, 1 moving toward the alley behind the shop, and Morrison himself standing boldly in the center of Main Street. Other townspeople had begun to appear in doorways and windows, drawn by the commotion. Doc Morrison emerged from his office down the street, no relation to Jake, as his expression of disgust made clear. "Morrison, you and your boys need to move along. We don't want your kind of trouble in Copper Creek." Jake laughed, a harsh sound that carried in the thin mountain air. "Doc, you stay out of this. I'm here for stolen property and I aim to get it back." That's when Mrs. Patterson surprised everyone by stepping out of her general store, a double-barreled shotgun cradled in her arms with obvious familiarity. "Jake Morrison, you're not welcome in this town. And that young woman isn't property. She's under our protection." Emma felt tears sting her eyes at the unexpected support. She'd found more than shelter in Copper Creek. She'd found people willing to stand with her. But Jake just smiled his cruel smile. "Well now, looks like the whole town's gotten attached to my merchandise. That's sweet, really, but business is business." He raised his voice again. "Reed, last chance, send her out or we'll come in shooting." Thomas stepped into the doorway then, rifle held ready, his presence radiating a deadly calm. The scars on his face seemed more pronounced in the harsh sunlight, making him look like a warrior from an older, more violent time. "There he is," Jake said with satisfaction. "Still not talking, I hear. That's all right. Your guns can do the talking for you." Thomas didn't respond, but Emma saw his finger move to the rifle's trigger guard. Whatever happened next, she realized, would happen fast. "I'll make you a deal, Reed," Jake continued, his voice taking on a false reasonableness. "The woman's worth about $200 to me. You pay that, and we'll ride out peaceful-like. No blood spilled, no one gets hurt." From her hiding spot, Emma saw Thomas shake his head once, a simple, definitive refusal. Jake's face hardened. "Well then, I guess we do this the hard way." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever, like the moment between lightning and thunder. Emma held her breath, watching Thomas's steady form in the doorway, remembering the gentle way he'd cared for her, the wordless promise he'd made to protect her. And then, impossibly, Thomas spoke. His voice was rough from disuse, barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the tense stillness of the street. "She stays." The words hit Emma like a physical blow. After 3 years of silence, after all the pain and loss he'd endured, Thomas had found his voice again, for her. Jake Morrison's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with calculating interest. "Well, I'll be damned. The silent man finds his tongue." He grinned. "Tell you what, Reed, since you're talking again, maybe we can negotiate after all." Thomas's response was to raise his rifle, the barrel pointing directly at Jake's chest. "All right then," Jake said, his hand moving to his pistol. "Boys, looks like we're going to have to earn our money the hard way." In the loft, Emma gripped the wooden beam beside her so hard her knuckles turned white. The confrontation she'd feared was about to begin, and the man who'd given her peace was about to risk everything to keep her safe. The street of Copper Creek had become a battlefield, and the next few minutes would determine whether the sanctuary they'd built together would survive or crumble into dust and blood. Time seemed suspended in that moment before violence erupted. Emma watched from above as Thomas stood motionless in the doorway, his rifle trained on Jake Morrison while the outlaw's hand hovered over his pistol grip. The entire street held its breath, waiting for someone to make the first move. It was Jake who broke first. His gun cleared leather with practiced speed, but Thomas had been expecting it. The blacksmith's rifle spoke first, its report echoing off the buildings like thunder in a canyon. Jake spun and fell, clutching his shoulder, his weapon spinning away across the dusty street. The other three outlaws immediately opened fire. Windows shattered as bullets flew across Main Street. Thomas dropped behind the solid wooden counter of his shop as lead whistled over his head, while Mrs. Patterson and Doc Morrison took cover behind whatever shelter they could find. Emma watched in terror as one of the outlaws rushed toward the shop's front entrance. Thomas appeared from behind the counter like a ghost, swinging the heavy rifle butt in a vicious arc that connected with the man's skull. The outlaw collapsed without a sound, but the other two were flanking the building, moving to trap Thomas inside. Emma could see what he couldn't. One man circling toward the back entrance while another maintained covering fire from across the street. "Behind you!" Emma shouted, forgetting her concealment. Thomas spun toward the back of the shop just as the outlaw kicked in the rear door. The man's pistol was already raised, aimed directly at Thomas's chest. There was no time for the rifle, no time for anything but reflexes honed by years of survival. Thomas threw himself sideways as the gun boomed, the bullet scoring a burning line across his ribs. He hit the ground hard, rolling behind his anvil as the outlaw advanced for a killing shot. That's when Emma made a decision that surprised even her. She grabbed the pistol Thomas kept in the loft. He'd shown it to her weeks ago, teaching her to load and fire it in case of emergency, and dropped through the loft opening like an avenging angel. The outlaw spun toward her, but Emma was already firing, her shots wild, but close enough to send him diving for cover. "Emma, get down!" Thomas called out, his voice stronger now, more natural. She hit the floor as he rose from behind the anvil, rifle ready. The outlaw tried to shoot from his hiding spot behind a workbench, but Thomas's aim was true. The man's gun fell silent forever. Outside, the last outlaw was retreating, unwilling to face the determined defense alone. Doc Morrison appeared in the doorway, his own rifle trained on Jake Morrison, who was still alive but bleeding heavily on the ground. "It's over," Doc called. "Drop your weapons and surrender, or we'll finish what you started." The remaining outlaw threw down his gun and raised his hands. His appetite for violence evaporated in the face of a town united against him. Thomas lowered his rifle and moved quickly to Emma, his hands gentle as he checked her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice still rough but growing more natural with each word. "No," Emma breathed, then threw her arms around him, not caring about propriety or what anyone might think. "You spoke. You found your voice again." Thomas held her close, feeling something inside his chest that had been frozen for 3 years finally begin to thaw. "Had to," he said simply. "Couldn't let them take you." Mrs. Patterson bustled into the shop, her motherly instincts overriding the aftermath of violence. "Well, I never," Thomas Reed talking again, and our Emma showing she's got more backbone than any 3 men. She paused to survey the damage, then nodded approvingly. "You two make quite a team." Doc Morrison appeared with his medical bag, kneeling beside Jake Morrison. "This one will live, though he'll never use that arm quite the same way again. What do you want to do with him, Thomas?" Thomas looked down at the man who tried to steal Emma's freedom, and for a moment the old rage flickered in his grey eyes. Then he glanced at Emma, saw the concern in her face, and made a choice that surprised everyone. including himself. "Turn him over to the territorial marshal," Thomas said. "Let the law handle it." Jake Morrison, despite his pain, managed a bitter laugh. "Gone soft, Reed? Time was, you'd have put a bullet in my head and been done with it." "Maybe I have gone soft," Thomas replied, his arm tightening around Emma's waist. "Found something worth being better for." Over the following weeks, as Thomas's wounds healed and the town returned to normal, something beautiful began to bloom in Copper Creek. Thomas's return to speech wasn't immediate or complete. There were still days when words came hard, moments when silence felt safer. But Emma understood, and she never pushed. She simply listened when he spoke and accepted his quiet when he didn't. They were married on a crisp October morning, with the entire town in attendance. Mrs. Patterson had altered the dress Thomas had given Emma, his first wife's dress, into something new and beautiful, symbolizing not a replacement of the past, but a transformation of it into hope for the future. During the ceremony, when the preacher asked Thomas to speak his vows, his voice carried clear and strong across the small church. "Emma, you came to me broken and somehow made me whole again. I promise to protect you, to care for you, and to love you with every word I speak and every silence we share." Emma's vows were simpler, but no less profound. "Thomas, you gave me peace when I had none, safety when I was lost, and love when I'd forgotten what it felt like. I promise to stand beside you, to honor both your words and your silences, and to help you heal as you've helped me." Dee. As they walked out of the church hand in hand, the autumn sun painting the mountains in shades of gold and copper, Emma marveled at the journey that had brought them together. She'd arrived in Copper Creek, broken and afraid, seeking only shelter from a cruel world. Instead, she'd found something much more precious. A love that spoke in gentle actions and protective silences, a partnership forged in mutual healing, and a future built on the solid foundation of two scarred souls who'd learned to trust again. Thomas squeezed her hand as they paused on the church steps, looking out over the town that had become their sanctuary. His body still bore the scars of his past. They always would. But Emma had learned to read the stories they told, not just of pain endured, but of strength discovered, of survival against impossible odds, and of a man who'd found his voice again in the act of protecting someone he loved. "Happy?" Thomas asked quietly, the word carrying all the tenderness he'd learned to feel again. Emma smiled, lifting their joined hands to her lips to kiss his scarred knuckles. "Happy," she confirmed, and in that single word, she gave him back what the world had tried to take away. The peace that comes from being truly known and unconditionally loved. Behind them, the church bells rang across Copper Creek, their joyful sound carrying on the mountain wind like a promise that even the most wounded hearts could learn to sing again. 5 years later, the sound of laughter echoed from the expanded blacksmith shop where Thomas Reed worked alongside his 7-year-old son Samuel, named for the father Thomas had lost but never forgotten. The boy chattered constantly as he helped organize tools, his young voice a bright counterpoint to his father's measured tones. Emma emerged from their small house behind the shop, cradling their infant daughter, Margaret, named for the wife whose memory Thomas had learned to honor without being imprisoned by it. The baby gurgled contentedly, her eyes the same gray as her father's, but already showing Emma's warmth. "Papa? Tell me again about the day you met Mama," Samuel demanded, as he did almost every evening. Thomas smiled, setting down his hammer to lift his son onto the workbench. His voice, once lost to tragedy, now carried easily in the peaceful air of their mountain town. "Well," Thomas began, glancing at Emma with eyes that held deep contentment. "She was the bravest person I'd ever seen, even though she was scared. And when I looked at her, I remembered something I'd forgotten." "What did you remember?" Samuel asked, though he knew the story by heart. "That sometimes the most important words are the ones you don't need to say out loud. Your mama taught me that love speaks in many ways. In the safety you offer, the peace you create, and the choice to protect what matters most." Emma joined them. settling beside Thomas on the workbench with baby Margaret in her arms. The scars were still there, across Thomas's hands and face, but they'd become part of the story rather than the end of it. Each mark now spoke not just of survival, but of the strength that had carried him through darkness into light. "And they lived happily ever after," Samuel prompted, completing the ritual. "They lived," Thomas corrected gently as he always did. "And they were happy. But more importantly, they helped each other become brave enough to keep living, keep loving, and keep believing that tomorrow could be better than yesterday." As the sun set over Copper Creek, painting the sky in familiar shades of copper and gold, the Reed family sat together in comfortable closeness. Thomas's voice carried on the evening air as he continued their son's bedtime story, each word a small miracle, a testament to the healing power of love, the strength found in vulnerability, and the truth that even the most wounded hearts can learn to speak again when they find the right person to listen. In the growing darkness, their home glowed with warm lamplight and the sound of family, proving that sometimes the greatest victories are not won in moments of violence, but in the quiet choice to open your heart again, to trust again, and to believe that peace is possible, even for souls marked by scars too deep for words.